I would like to just do a little introduction before the talk because we're going to speak about generational trauma, which means that the worst that humans can do to humans is passed down through the generations. So that means it's not pleasant. It's ugly. It's almost unbelievable sometimes. And it is utterly overwhelming if you really listen and let yourself down into it. So that means that starting now until the end, you're going to feel overwhelmed. Welcome to COP. However, what I would like to do is invite you to stay there. It is human beings' natural reaction to push that away and distract and everything else. But as I always tell young therapists, that when you are sitting across from a trauma survivor, part of what you end up is feeling their overwhelmedness, feeling their anxiety, feeling those things. Let that feeling inform you just a little bit of what it's like to be those that we're talking about. And I would also like to promise you that at the end, when I have the closing remarks, I will leave you with lots of hope. So it's out there. But go through the experience first so it can inform you, because after this is over, you get to go home. People who live with this often don't even know what a home feels like. So come with me into generational trauma. Every human life, without exception, is a force in this world. Our influence, our impact, flows out of us perpetually. It never stops. You think about the tiniest newborn who can influence busy or sleeping adults in the middle of the night. Now, hopefully that influence stirs those adults to wake up and care and feed for that tiny dependent baby. If those adults refuse, turn a deaf ear, or harden their hearts, rejection, not care, then becomes the foundation of that tiny life. It is its beginning, its roots are in rejection. So obviously the most helpless influence us. And then we must choose how to respond to that influence. So it's determined in part by their need, and secondly by our chosen response. An exhausted adult can readily and sweetly respond to those cries at 3 a.m., or a responsible adult can respond in a way that looks pretty good, but underneath they are forming layers of anger and resentment, which becomes the felt undercurrent over the child's life. It goes without saying that the response of the adults in turn shape that malleable child. It is an important principle, this principle of influence, if we are going to understand generational trauma. In the 1960s, the concept of concentration camp syndrome or survivor syndrome began to be noticed and labeled by clinicians in Canada. They were seeing children of Holocaust survivors. And so these children were coming and asking for treatment, and it was apparent that they also were suffering from trauma symptoms. Further down the line over the years, the grandchildren of those survivors were found to be overrepresented by 300% in referrals for counseling and things as compared to the general population. So these are the grandchildren of the Holocaust survivors, represented by over 300%. So at first, when they encountered the phenomenon, they said the children have secondary trauma. But when the same symptoms were evident in the third generation, a new term was born: intergenerational transmission of trauma. So here's what I hope that we can do with this topic this morning. First, I want to give us just a few theological underpinnings. Thanks. Theological underpinnings to help us understand this idea of things being passed down through the generations. And then second, look at some of the psychological mechanisms that favor the transmission of trauma across the generations. And we will look at those in the context of child development and parenting, and how a traumatized adult transmits trauma to a child. Third, generational trauma can also be transmitted not just through personal identity, but also through social identity. I think we have a taste of that from what we just heard about Iran. Community and national identities can reinforce trauma not just by beliefs or by the way history is told, though those certainly do that, but also by way of enduring social structures, which we'll talk a little bit about and Phil will talk about. We're going to consider just briefly a few case studies in that segment. And then finally, most of which has to wait until Thursday, what do we do? How do we respond to massive multi-generational trauma? How do you do anything except feel overwhelmed? What does it look like to bring the grace and truth of God to that? There is indeed an answer. So first, go back to the beginning of life with me. And God said, let us make man in our image according to our likeness, and let them rule over the world. And he told them what? To bear fruit. And I think that means a lot more than just babies. Bear fruit, be creative, make beauty everywhere in all the avenues that humans have. Multiply, he's saying, make more of what I have already made, which is creatures in my likeness. Make more in my likeness. Transmit my likeness down through the generations. Fill the earth, command it for good. Adam and Eve were abundantly blessed by God so that they in turn might bless the earth and the succeeding generations, multiplying the likeness of God everywhere they went. In Genesis 12, after things got all blown up, and humans were no longer passing down the blessing of God to others, God says to Abram, leave your country, your national identity, your relatives, your family identity, your place of origin, where your roots are. And I will make you, which I think probably means I will remake you, into a great nation and bless you, and in you, what? All the families of the earth will be blessed. That includes us. In both these instances, God is seen as pouring down his blessing in abundance down through the generations, even after humans sinned. Obviously, that tells us something about our God, doesn't it? But it also tells us something about being human. Humans have been created to pass down what they have. It's simply part of who we were made to be. We can't help it. It's in us. Sadly, as with all things that were originally made to be, the mechanism meant for the abundant blessing of generations has been twisted and ruined. So humans continue to pass down to others, but as we know, it is often not blessing that is transmitted, but disease and ruin and trauma instead. Scripture is also replete with references to God responding to ruin with another promise of blessing. Isaiah 61:4, they will rebuild the ancient ruins. They will raise up the former devastations. They will repair the desolations of generations. Zechariah 8, old men and women will sit in the streets, and the city will be filled with boys and girls playing in the streets. So the most vulnerable, the elderly and the little ones, will be safe in the streets. God will restore a place of safety and blessing to humankind. Lastly, Psalm 106, which was also sung by Mary, God's mercy is on them that fear him from generation to generation, and his faithfulness to children's children. Humans, you and I, were created to transmit blessing. The mechanism remains. You and I, however, often see as part of our work the tragic suffering and evil that results in traumatized humans rather than blessed ones. Now, when we first started talking about trauma in this country, we used to think of it as an event, and there were distressed human beings after the event showing certain symptoms. And that can certainly be true. But we are now recognizing that trauma can be a multifaceted, long-enduring part of life and do long-term damage to body, mind, heart, and soul. It is crucial in our desire to relieve suffering and speak truth that we have some understanding of the nature of trauma and its effects on the transmission of generational trauma. Otherwise, the work that we do will not be based on this all-encompassing and overwhelming reality. So it's my hope that after today, we will see clearly the profound and often overwhelming results of trauma reverberating not only down through the generations, but down through the centuries. It is also my hope that we will be encouraged as the week goes on and recognize that bit by bit, with one at a time, in one little life, where trauma ceases to govern and hope springs up, that God, by his design of humans, will take that tiny little bit of healing that your life and work transmitted to another and not only bless that person, but future generations you will never meet. It's an abundant outcome beyond our ability and comprehension. He can and he will rebuild ancient human ruins through us, piece by piece. Researchers have identified several psychological mechanisms that seem to lead to intergenerational trauma. Most of those fall under the diagnosis of what we now refer to as complex trauma. Complex psychological trauma is different than PTSD. It tends to involve stressors that are repetitive, often for years or even a lifetime, and chronic. It involves direct harm and or neglect by those who should have been caregivers or because of the utter lack of caregivers. It occurs often at developmentally vulnerable times in a life and has the potential to severely compromise human development. PTSD is not a significant diagnosis for those who are marinated in abuse and terror over an extended period of time. Complex trauma involves interpersonal violence that is usually repeated and chronic with profound relational betrayal, deception, and coercion. It includes things like child abuse of any kind, physical, sexual, verbal, emotional. It includes chronic neglect. It includes those who have lived through genocidal regimes, those who were tortured as war criminals, those who have been relentlessly abused by religious figures. It includes things like slavery, domestic violence, and extreme poverty. What that means is that how the brain works, how the body works, how the self is understood, how thoughts are organized, how the world is labeled, emotions named and regulated or not, and how relationships are understood and conducted, all have their roots in the life-destroying acid of trauma. So think with me about one individual case. This is a little girl who was born into a very violent home who was supposed to be a boy. And the very first incident in her tiny life when she's brought home from the hospital is to have her father's cigarettes put out on the bottom of her baby feet for the audacity of showing up as a female. She goes on in that lifetime as a child to be raped by father, brothers, uncles, males in the extended family, and anybody who would pay for her. She was frequently chained to a radiator and forced to eat with the dogs. She had to find food in trash bins, and by the age of 12 was trafficked across state lines by her father. This is a human being, though she did not believe herself to be one, actually, created in the image of our God, who has known constant distress from birth, from which there was no escape, constant fear, gross insecurity, negligence, instability, pain, ridicule, you name it. This is a person who never once knew the experience of pain followed by comfort and safety. Now you think about your own children or children you know. They fall and skin their knee. What happens? Somebody runs and helps them and kisses it and makes it better. That's just a tiny thing in the scope of life. She never knew that connection of two things like that. So for many people, trauma is not a terrifying event, followed by care, but an utterly and relentlessly terrifying life. And if there is any respite during their lifetime, it usually comes in the form of alcohol, drugs, self-injury, or dissociation. Those are their medications. So as a result of chronic interpersonal trauma, the individual develops constant vigilance, constant anticipation of danger, chronic anxiety, and terror. Fear is not strong enough. They are never at ease. All the person's psychological energy is bent by necessity toward protecting themselves, coping, surviving, not toward learning and growing like children are supposed to be doing. So rather than learning and imagining and experimenting, they are instead learning to be afraid, to hide, and to self-protect. They have been betrayed. They have been separated from those who should be caring or would have been nurturing. They cannot find or seek assistance or safety anywhere because there is no safe person in their world or because of ongoing threats in their lives. Please keep in mind this does not just happen to children. It also happens to adults. Obviously, children are much more malleable, but we never stop being malleable as human beings unless we're dead. So while we live, we are still learning and being shaped, and therefore we can be significantly damaged. And adults have been significantly and unalterably damaged under Hitler, under Pol Pot, in Romania's Pitești prison. Adult Native Americans, with everything ripped away from them, permanently damaged. Slavery in America, generations permanently damaged. Also keep in mind that trauma is not just something that can happen to one person, but to an entire group of people. Ask those who have slaves in their background. Ask Native Americans. People who have lost home, way of life, traditions, children, faith, language, community. It is crushing on a human being and its impact. It destroys personhood. So I want you to do something. I'm going to take us briefly through what are called Erikson's stages of development. But before I do that, I want you to think of one child or two. I don't care who it is. It could be you when you were little. It could be your own child or a child in your life. Or it could be a child that you know who's been traumatized that you have worked with in some fashion or had contact with. And I want you to think about that child or two when we go through these stages and what would happen to them if the things that they should have been learned were not learned and trauma was instead the governing force. Do keep in mind that the brain of a child is not fully developed until 24 years of age. And we give them car keys. So think about the girl I just described. She ran away from home at 14. She had an extended family history of sexual and physical violence, shame, humiliation, scrounging for food, and addictions. Her brain had been marinated in all of that. She hits the streets at 14 because she can't stand it anymore. And she's picked up by somebody she will now call Daddy and experience more violence, humiliation, and addictions and deceptions and violations as he sells her. Her brain will continue to marinate in that for about 10 more years. So keeping all that in mind, and the child you've chosen, listen and see what's happening to a developing child created purposefully in the image of God. First stage, birth to 18 months. The child is developing an attitude of trust or mistrust. And they're learning whether or not hope is a thing that exists. So the major emphasis, obviously, in the first year and a half, is on the mother and the father's nurturing ability and care, particularly in terms of visual contact and touch. So the child will develop optimism, trust, confidence, and security if properly cared for. I cry, mommy comes. I cry, daddy comes. I fall down, somebody picks me up and comforts me. That's developing trust. It's also hope. because I cry with hope. I ask for help with hope. If those things aren't happening and those responses are not there, you already, by 1.5, have started a chronic level of anxiety in a child and general mistrust of the world. And if there's hope, it's very fragile by 18 months. Second stage, 18 months to 3 years, this is when the child begins, it's the toddler thing, the autonomy. I can do it by myself. But there's also, or the possibility, if that doesn't begin to happen, is the feeling of shame becomes powerful in the child's life. You stupid kid, what'd you do it like that for? Well, I did it like that because I'm 2. But if you get talked to like that, you develop a sense of self that is full of shame. And the child is learning that they have a will. They can make choices. Mommy says, do this. They don't do that. They exercise their will. So during this time, children tend to be very vulnerable because they can easily be shamed. And oftentimes it happens simply because they try something new, because they're quite adventuresome then, and it doesn't work. And how you respond is critical because they can feel shamed by the way you respond. 3, preschooler, 3 to 5 years. Here the things are an attitude of initiative or guilt. And they begin to develop a sense of purpose. I'm actually a person who's here, who can do things, and I'm here for reasons. Children this age copy us. They want to be little adults, They're playing out their roles in a trial universe. So they make up stories with dolls and soldiers, and they play with toy trucks and toy phones and all that kind of stuff. Little mini grown-ups. It's also the stage where you hear the most wonderful and annoying question, why? The main relationship in this stage is the network of the whole family, not just mommy and daddy now, but beyond that. And the sense that I belong to this group and I am valued. I'm worth something to this group. I have a voice and I have a purpose. The family is the safe base. When that does not happen, because children at this age are, in case you have forgotten, utterly egocentric. Yes? So if something bad happens, whose fault is it? The child's. So when I sit across from an adult survivor of sexual abuse all throughout childhood, it wasn't daddy or grandpa's or the neighbor man's or whoever's fault, it was mine. And many of them have been told that if you weren't such a bad girl, I wouldn't have to do this. So that whole sense of self then is marinated in being labeled bad. 4, school age, 6 to 12 years, attitude of being industrious or feeling inferior. And what they're developing is a sense of competence or not. So they're learning and creating and developing new skills and knowledge in school and a sense of industry because they have homework and they have things to do, and they learn that they are competent to make things happen. If I do this, this is the result. If I don't do this, this is the result. This is a very social stage. It's a place where children can easily begin to feel inadequate and inferior. As the world expands a bit, their significant relationship goes out from the family and becomes school and neighborhood. Then adolescence, 12 to 18. Identity or role confusion. I'm not really sure who I am or why I'm here. And learning a sense of fidelity. And part of what that means is the integrity of the self over time. I am this person, I can do these things, I'm not so good at those things. I like this, I don't like that. This is the same self I am over time. When children are abused and neglected, that sense of self does not develop, or it's constantly changing depending on who's abusing them how. So this is the season of learning about right and wrong, making choices socially and things like that. But you think of that little girl that I described. Her sense of self at this point is impaired and twisted. How does somebody at this age develop a sense of morality when they have never had anyone treat them morally? Where's it going to come from? Who am I? What is my purpose? Where do I belong? Do I make choices that have integrity? Young adult, 18 to 35, developing intimacy, solidarity versus isolation. This is when connections are made relationally. This is when people get married and make babies. This is when people have groups of friends or groups of working friends that they connect with and things like that. And again, if you have no sense of self, if you've always been the bad one, if you feel utterly incompetent and are constantly anxious and everything else, what do you want to do around people? Run. You find ways to hide, which could be literally not being with people, or it could be drinking a lot of alcohol whenever you are, or something like that. And then you go on to the grown-up people, the 40s to 65s. So you think about having a life like this girl did. You know, what is this person going to be like as an adult? Not productive, highly wounded, not feeling worth anything to anybody. You know, 40 to 65 is when adults start to think about legacy or how to bless others in your own family and otherwise. And then late adult, 65 and up, you either have a sense of integrity across your lifetime or you may develop a sense of despair. If you've had chronic trauma, it's pretty easy to see what you have. So what do we have in those with complex trauma? Mistrust, no hope. Shame, no sense of ability or choice. Guilt, no purpose short of survival. Inferiority, not competent at anything. No sense of self or identity, no sense that this is who I choose to be. No integrity of the self. Isolated, no experience of love, ever. No safety in relationships, no sense of purpose except survival. Despair, hopelessness, lack of purpose are predominant. The person has been altered, shaped by chronic, complex trauma. That has been the greatest shaping force in their lives. They've been incubated in mistrust and despair and fear and worthlessness and hopelessness and shame. Now, again, I said this can happen to adults. You can take an adult with a relatively healthy childhood and throw them into Auschwitz, or throw them into Petsesti prison, or Tuol Sleng, the torture prison in Phnom Penh, or traffic them, or rip them away from their continent and their family and their tribe and put them on a ship and take them back to your house and make them a slave, or remove them from their own land and take their children and destroy all they hold dear, and you will utterly traumatize those adults to the extent that the former identity and structure of the self is dismantled and crushed. These are the things that have been woven in and shaped who the person is. Because you see, complex trauma is not just about feelings and thoughts. It's about the I am. Not I feel this or I think this or this was done to me. I am this. Now, I'm not going to give you a study of complex trauma today, but I do want to give you the aspects of it that research has shown are most likely to lead to transgenerational trauma. They create a fertile environment for passing on trauma. So one of these, they have a significant impact on parenting, and that's why. One of these is that complex trauma alters the ability to regulate your feelings and impulses. So people with prolonged trauma tend to overreact to stress. They become easily overwhelmed. Some of them always feel overwhelmed and anxious. They have great difficulty calming themselves. Nobody ever calmed them, so they never learned how. And they are often self-destructive in some fashion. They find it difficult to monitor anger and or anxiety, and they don't do well managing impulses of suicide, sometimes sexual acting out or risk-taking behavior, sometimes modulating with things like addictions and self-harm, like self-injury or something like that. And the interesting and ironic thing, which it took those of us in the therapeutic world a while to figure out, is that these self-destructive mechanisms like cutting, which the therapist immediately wants to stop, actually are sometimes keeping people alive. So if I drink myself under the table, I won't commit suicide. So you want to take the drinking away, which you do, but you can't just do this, because it's literally what keeps them alive, because it pushes the pain down. Second, in complex trauma, we see alterations in attention or consciousness. So if you can't escape trauma, there's no door out, it becomes overwhelming, and people can't use the things that you and I would use in normal situations. You know, if I don't like something, I either get away from it, I tell somebody to stop, or I fight back. Well, that doesn't help if you're 3 years old and in the kind of home I described with this young woman, or if you're in a torture prison. Those things do not work. So when those coping mechanisms are overwhelmed and there's no escape, there is a huge correlation then between trauma and dissociation. And there have been several studies that suggest that dissociation at the point of trauma is the most significant long-term predictor for developing a trauma disorder. So what that means is you can't integrate your story. It's too big. It's too overwhelming. I mean, how does a 3 or 5 or 8-year-old integrate things like I have described? They can't. So there's no narrative in your head because the narrative would, knock you down. Can't be effectively cataloged, labeled, or understood. And this is certainly true for children, partly because they have a limited vocabulary and they don't understand anything. But if you put yourself in a torture prison, things happen to you and people act toward you in ways that you would never have dreamed of. You couldn't have made them up. So where do you put them? There's no file. And so that's where dissociation kicks in. So you think about it. You're 5 years old. You live in a house where you're chronically neglected, beaten, and raped. And in addition, there's violence from the gang in the neighborhood. And your parents are drug addicts. How do you put that in your brain at 5? You can't. So in order to absorb memories, or we often absorb sensations like what we see or smell or feel, or the cognitive craziness of growing up like that, all of those things, if you put it all in your head at 5 years old, you would be stark raving mad. And the same thing is true for an adult in a place like Patesti Prison or Tool Sling. You would be stark raving mad. So you have to find a way to leave or distance yourself. So that's what people do. Survivors of Auschwitz speak of this. They will say, there's me and there's not me. And the not me is what happened in Auschwitz. There's a book, a fascinating book called The Orphan Master's Son, which won a Pulitzer Prize. It's by a man named Adam Johnson, and it's about North Korea. It's a fictional book, but it is frankly a very realistic portrayal of torture and a glimpse into hell. And the main character dissociates. And his torturers, who are trying to control him, at one point say in the book, he goes to some place, some faraway place, and we cannot reach him. He ceases to react. The character says this, which is quite eloquent. And he's telling you about a torture prison, but this is what he calls it. He says, in pain school, they taught me to find my reserve, a private place where I could go, in my head, in unbearable moments. A pain reserve is like a real reserve, you see. You put a fence around it, you attend to its welfare, you keep it pristine, and you deal with all trespassers. Nobody can know what your pain reserve is, because if you lost it, you would lose everything. When he was being tortured, he used to talk about how his mind and body split. So my mind goes over here to the reserve, and over here is my body being tortured. That's how he survived. And then third, we see distortions in relationships. Obviously, repetitious, premeditated abuse results in all kinds of relational disorders, attachment disorders as we call them. When an individual is chronically mistreated and abused, it leads often to things like recurring victimization, can't trust, even victimizing others. They're unable to feel close and safe with other people. So they have no model for healthy relationships, so they can't make good and wise choices. I mean, you cannot do what you cannot imagine. You have to have a picture in your head of something, or you can't do it, or draw it, or whatever. So they numb out fear. They often miss warning signs and feel helpless because they are not attached. This significantly affects child rearing. So you think about this. You're with a parent who can't regulate emotions, right? You're with a parent who doesn't attach and connect, and you're with a parent who dissociates, which means you say something to them and they stand there and look at you with this blank look on their face, and it's like nobody's home. That's going to affect this little 3-year-old. So if you just take those 3 things and put them in a parent of small children, it becomes obvious that they too are going to be immersed in trauma. So they're going to lead a predictable, chaotic life because they can't control affect and impulses, right? They see relationships as dangerous, even this size relationship. They isolate, or they really, really become controlling because they're so afraid all the time. And we know how that goes in parenting. A dissociative parent is there and not there. And then you have parents who have flashbacks. So you have a mommy standing in the kitchen who's been in a prison, let's say, or in Auschwitz or something, and all of a sudden she's in a flashback. She drops the pot, she falls on the floor, she's screaming, she's fighting the perpetrator off, and you have a little 5-year-old boy watching who feels terrified, doesn't understand what's going on, and utterly unsafe, which is just like his mommy felt. So if you take all those things and go back to the stages, then you have a child who is likely to have trauma transmitted to them and then transmitted to the next generation. Then think briefly about, this is a lot of personal identity stuff, but which that has to do with who am I and who are you and who are we and how do we learn who we are and all of that. So we develop personal identity, but we also develop social identity. When you develop personal identity in a healthy place, you end up with the fidelity of the self all across the lifespan. Trauma affects the structure and continuity of that self. Just like the Auschwitz survivor, this is me and not me. There's no continuity there. There's no integrity of the self. People who lived with trauma often say, I was, but now I am. So I was before the trauma, but now I am. There's a discontinuity between pre and post-trauma self. So in brutal torture or dehumanizing treatment, people talk about being human, but that now they're not. The trauma eradicated their humanity. They're less than human. Holocaust survivors often talk about how nobody ever asked them their name. They thought no one could deprive them of their name. It never occurred to them. They knew going into Auschwitz or wherever they were that somebody could take away their wealth, their rights, and their freedom and their dignity, but nobody could take away their name. Well, they did take away their name. And in the torture prison in Phnom Penh, in Tuol Sleng, they lost their names. You come in on February 15th, your name is 215. There's no names. It was the number on their shirt became their name. When Native American children were taken away from their parents and put in boarding schools, they didn't have the same name. They lost their home and their parent and their language and their traditions. I was, but now I am. And of course, often children do not even remember the I was if they were young enough when it was taken away from them. Trauma destroys social identity, which is the sense of belonging to a social group with some emotional attachment to that group. That's social identity. It can be your nation, your tribe, your ethnicity, your faith. When we're robbed of those identities, it feels like our underpinnings moved. It's also complicated if you look down through history because there are people who survive trauma by being other than who they are. So you think of the Jewish children in Europe who got different passports and different names, and now they weren't Jewish anymore. And then you think of, as an adult later, trying to go back and find out who your birth family was, and even if you find them, you no longer fit. Because they went through the war as Jews, and you went through the war as Aryan. Many people experience the loss of personal and social identity. And they experience social alienation from being removed from their social identity group. It profoundly not only affects them, but profoundly affects the generations. So we mentioned an individual case. Here's one about a particular group of people who not only experienced trauma at young ages, but also were victims of the social structure and national crises, and continue to be so to this day. Communist dictator Ceausescu. His iron rule of Romania resulted in many tragedies and traumas to the Romanians due to decades of brutal oppression and fear and intimidation. Pătesti prison is infamous for what it did. The most terrifying fruit of his evil was found after he was assassinated. Thousands of children, diseased and emaciated, basically imprisoned in filth-infested cribs in state orphanages, wasting away. I remember when the pictures came out in the newspapers. Now, 28 or so years later, those children who never had parents, who never had nurture, who grew up in filth, were released from those orphanages, and they went underground into the sewers of Bucharest to live. And they're still there. And not only that, now they're making babies. They live in filthy underground slums. Heroin, glue, paint, and synthetic drugs are rampant, so is AIDS and STIs. These young adults never had a parent. They don't know what one is like. They have known filth and hunger and rejection. They have not remotely had a taste of what it means to be precious and in the image of God. And given the lack of nutrition, sunlight, drugs, the possibility of handicaps in their offspring is absolutely huge. They have never witnessed a good parent-child relationship, so they don't know what to do with the baby. They survive and deaden their pain. And you think back to the developmental stages we considered. The sewer children are raising sewer children, who will raise sewer children, who will raise sewer children. That's a pretty hopeless transmission. Started by an evil despot whose oppression and control bore this fruit, which will now continue for many generations, because the mechanism still works. Or consider an entire nation, and yes, Phil was right, Cambodia. Pol Pot, totalitarian dictator. He orchestrated the genocide killing of 3 million of his own people, which happened to be a third of the population. He emptied the cities, forced them into labor camps. They were tortured. There were mass executions, malnutrition, physical abuse, rampant disease. He destroyed, this is the thing I found most overwhelming and horrifying. He literally calculated, and he says this, he destroyed in a purposeful and calculated way every human bond he could think of. It's like the man sat down at the feet of Satan and said, okay, tell me how this image of God thing works. Well, it's seen this way, and it's seen in these relationships. Okay, I'll destroy this, I'll destroy this, I'll destroy this. That's what he did. Marriage, killed all the fathers. Family, can't be together. Community, nope. No faith allowed. No cultural expressions, no traditions, nothing. These are all very human things that are the means God uses for us to pass blessing. You think of traditions in your own home, growing up or now. You're passing blessing on to your children. He killed it all. Everything that gave people identity or purpose or safety or meaning was destroyed. As much as he could, he wiped out the face of humanity. Many years ago, when I was here working in Philadelphia, a Cambodian pastor asked to meet with me. And he said to me that of all the immigrants in the city of Philadelphia, the Cambodians did not climb. All the others had children who were more educated, got jobs, had more money, and all of those things. They went higher than their parents. That's why immigrants come, right? So their children can be blessed. Cambodians did not, and he wondered if perhaps it was because of the trauma of the Khmer Rouge. He was correct, because what he was encountering was the long reach of Cambodia's killing fields down through the generations, still killing souls on the streets of Philadelphia. Parents and siblings gone for many who had no identity or relationships or knew where they were or who they were. Hideous memories of their own traumatic experiences, somehow trying to build a life. Go back with me to the beginning this morning. Every human life is a force in this world. Our influence pours out perpetually. It is a God-given mechanism meant for the purpose of humans flooding, influencing God's world and all that is in it with his blessing seen in us and given to the next generation. But you look at what we've considered. Instead of blessing, cursing, down through the generations. The concept of generational transmission of trauma is not at all hard to see and believe. And of all people that I know, you all have seen it in your own nations, in groups that you've worked with, in all kinds of places around this world. We said that humans have been created in part to pass on to others what has been given to them. It is simply part of who we were made to be. It cannot be stopped. It can be changed, but it cannot be stopped. And sadly, as with all the things you and I were originally made to be, the mechanism meant for the abundant blessing of others has been twisted and ruined, and so humans continue to pass down to others not blessings, but trauma.